I don't legally understand what the hell this is, but RFK Jr. is asking his lawyer to ask the FDA to overturn the polio vaccine, filing a petition to do that, to overturn the polio. Now, I didn't think polio was going to be like the first vaccine. And it is very ironic, guys, because polio was the vaccine literally given away for free. And apparently we're supposed to be mad at like big pharma's, greed. It's like, bitch, polio was for free. Obviously then people went on to make tons and tons. Obviously pharmaceutical industries went to make tons of money at, but RFK Jr.'s lawyer, Mr. Siri, is also filing a petition that seeks to pause the distribution of 13 other vaccines. And in some cases, those were quashed. COVID vaccine mandates around the country sued federal agencies for disclosure of records related to vaccine approvals and subjected prominent vaccine scientists to grueling videotape depositions. So he's not even in office yet. He has not been approved. RFK Jr. has not been confirmed, and he's coming in hot. What do you understand of why this is happening?
My reading of the article, because if you read across different media organizations, it's in the past tense. So my understanding is Siri has previously filed to end the polio vaccine. I think that they're covering it from the angle of this is someone who's consulting with Bobby for the next administration about who to pick for staff. He has also made his career, like Kennedy has, with vaccine lawsuits. So I'm not sure that the polio vaccine, ending it right now, is new because he's not in position yet. The framework is that he's done this before.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, zooming out on Bobby, we've done so many episodes on him. I think it's about a dozen. And I mean, this discrepancy over like, is polio actually going to be the first thing that he tackles or not? Or, is there some timeline issue that we're not really seeing? Everything is kind of obscure with him. And, it's not only because, he's incredibly disorganized as a communicator, very difficult for him to delegate things. The campaign was a total mess. But also, there's just nothing that comes out of Bobby's mouth that isn't bullshit. And it's a particular flavor of bullshit that hooks into plausible suspicions and grievances, about the modern world, and bureaucracy and its hypocrisies and people's feeling of alienation from it. Mm-hmm. The majority of the time, his ideas are these romantic nature fallacy, kind of strange, drivelly spiritual ideas that mourn over a golden age that never was, which is really, really ironic when we're talking about polio.
Yeah.
But he also ends up casting this effective spell of spiritual warriorship and divine intuition over followers who are disenchanted with all of the institutions, and they think they can, he can give everybody the life of a gentleman farmer, So
I just think it's also particularly egregious that some of the things the vaccines that he's specifically going after, it's not like he's like going after the HPV vaccine, which is a breakthrough and great and all this, but it's specifically vaccines that have saved children's lives over decades, generations, and like that is truly who is in the crosshairs and who is most at risk under a Bob Kennedy HHS department.
Yeah, and I don't think that everything Kennedy says is bullshit, but he obscures things and he makes himself sound plausible. So for example, he says he wants to end pharma lobbying. I would love that, but it's the biggest lobby in DC. And since 1990, Republicans have benefited more than Democrats, so they're not going to end that. He says he wants to end direct-to-consumer advertising. We are one of 2 countries in the world that allow pharma to advertise directly to consumers. I would love that, but go back to my pharma lobby comment. They're never going to go for that. And he says we have a chronic disease epidemic. That is true. The problem is that his solutions don't match what would actually help it. Things such as universal health care.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about that, but yes, Matthew.
Well, I think the big question is just how effective is he going to be? And I am personally preparing for the worst just because of his ardency. Like, this is a guy who believes who he is guided, and he says this openly, by his mystical communion with God. And he seems to have the goal, always a huge goal, repairing the entire American psyche and soul, which I think for him and for his followers, the rupture really goes right back to that being blown apart on the grassy knoll and at the Ambassador Hotel. And he is unstoppable in his drivenness. This is what everybody around him says. There's no contradiction in what he says. There's no honoring his family legacy. There's no act of like throwing his more progressive followers under the bus or reckoning with accusations of sexual assault that are going to stop him.
Sure. Well, those definitely wouldn't stop anyone in the Trump administration.
Right. And specifically for him, he is so hell-bent on this notion of purification of, America's body and soul. And to me, it's got to be rooted in this, very shameful side quest he took into 14 years of addiction. And he seems to associate all chemical interventions, into pain and suffering, to stop pain and suffering, as kind of debased distractions from true healing. And his followers really, really buy into that.
Sure. Especially as you guys have talked about and we've talked about when you've been on the show, he's preying on a very real disgust with the pharmaceutical industry, that, yes, it markets directly to us and costs exorbitant amounts of money, and no one seems to be reining that in. And it's like, okay, so there's lack of trust in big pharma, and he's capitalizing on that to say, yes, any kind of intervention is awful. And, I see stories about, hospitals ratting out the pregnant patients that they administered fentanyl to for having drugs in their system. And you're like, this is the perfect storm that creates people who are like, well, you shouldn't birth in a hospital in the first place. Right. Go into the woods, like the natural birthing psychos that you've talked about, I know, on your show. But to Derek's point, and I love the way you guys get into both of this, because one of you is like, it's like, okay, it's weirder than that. But I like Derek, talking about, okay, let's get rid of the pharma lobbying. Let's talk about, for example, cornstarch that is in everything, or corn syrup that's in everything, right? High fructose corn syrup, something that, Mayor Michael Bloomberg in his time tried to get rid of, and the right freaked out about it. Now the right, I guess, doesn't have a problem with that. But here's Bernie Sanders sort of speaking on this, like, can we work with RFK Jr.? And I wanted to get your guys' reactions.
Food industry concerned about their profits, could care less about the health of the American people. I think they have to be taken on. I think, on the other hand, when you talk about,
hang on, let me back.
I think you have a food industry concerned about their profits, could care less about the health of the American people. I think they have to be taken on. I think, on the other hand, when Mr. Kennedy talks about taking fluoride out of our water system, I think what the scientific community will tell you, that would be a disaster in terms of dental health in this country. His views on vaccine are in very wrong in so many ways. We will see how the process unfolds. So I think what he's saying about the food industry makes sense to me. A lot of other things that he's saying are extremely dangerous.
No, he actually said early on, he said, I think it's exactly correct. Take a look.
From what I've not talked to Mr. Kennedy in a number of years, actually. I think what he is saying about the food industry is exactly correct.
So that was the line that got taken by news outlets, and lifted up. What he's saying is exactly correct. Now, he then caveated it, obviously, with, I don't agree with him on vaccines and other things. That's very dangerous and worrisome, but the die was cast. What do you like? What is your reaction to Bernie saying, okay, but he's exactly correct on the food industry?
I think that's Bernie leaving a sound clip hanging, which actually means he's exactly right about predatory capitalism. Like, that's his vein. He's saying, he's probably referring to price gouging and, poor, labor practices and things that really are within his lane of the 1%, because inequality is his expertise. And then, of course, he has to go back and backtrack, right? He has to clean that up.
Sure. Well, I mean, I do also think like food chemicals, right? And pesticides, it's like just because people want, I mean, it's prohibitively expensive, but if you want to buy organic, that is now seemingly like the lane and the realm of the RFK Jr. supporters. But you have to go against big agriculture. Trump's not going to go against big ag. So to me, and I'm curious, Derek, about your thoughts, but it's like, for me, it's like, oh, you just gave him kind of a win there. Like, I think he's correct. And yet he's so deeply and dangerously wrong on so many things. But what do you think?
Well, I think that Americans generally need a better education in chemistry because that's a lot of the problem here. What RFK is exploiting is chemophobia as well as the naturalistic fallacy. So the idea that what's natural is good and whatever's created in a lab is bad. And
Sure.
that comes directly from an ignorance of chemistry. So when you talk about high fructose corn syrup, you're talking about a 5% difference between fructose and sucrose. That's where the high comes in. But if you talk to anyone, any actual chemist, they'll tell you that in our body, that's not going to actually make any sort of comparable difference. So there's an argument to be made here for the corn industry pushing corn because of all the subsidies from the 1970s and why that might be a problem throughout products.
Mhm.
But when you're actually talking about the health risks, they're negligible. The real question is, why are so many high sugar processed foods? Why is that all people can afford? And why do they exist in food deserts, whereas access to fresh food is not available?
Yeah.
So Kennedy is really good at finding all these downstream problems like glyphosate, like food additives, and like HFCS, which are not actual problems, and making them seem like the problems, instead of looking upstream at the fact that we don't actually have universal health care and the fact of why does the United States out of all countries rank extremely high in terms of food safety, but extremely low in terms of food accessibility. And those are questions that the Maha crowd never actually address.
Maha. I can't believe we're actually saying Maha. I mean, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm not a chemist. I don't understand, but I also know glyphosate is not good for the human body. Like I know the studies. I've seen the studies in like, this is Monsanto's Roundup Ready, right? Where they use that in soy crops throughout Argentina, for example, where I used to live. And what the spraying of the glyphosate did and the Roundup Ready did was like severely debilitate the populations. There meant cancer, birth defects, but there's no way that he's going to be able to get that out of our agricultural industry, like that seems like it's not going to happen. Like, I don't think that we're going to give up like pesticides and herbicides, like willingly.
No, no, absolutely not going to. I would ask for a chemist to be on because I've heard much different data in terms of the actual problems of glyphosate. And it's also true that the United States sprays less than a lot of other countries. We just are a larger country. So by volume, it seems more, but per acre, it's actually less than a lot of other countries. And the cancer incidences are usually related to agricultural workers who are around the product all the time, which is a real problem as compared to the consumer level where the toxicity levels are lower. Now, to your broader question about them going against them, no, they're not. The entire MAGA project, and by extension, the Maha project, is about deregulation that is going to favor corporations. So the idea that they're going to go after them in any meaningful way is ludicrous.
Totally. No, I appreciate you're right about it. Yes, it affects farm workers primarily. And I agree that it is part of, sort of the opaqueness of every industry and the big lobbying arms of every industry. And to Matthew's point about both of your points, it really is about capitalism. And it also is about a lack of access to food, healthy food, and a lack of access to healthcare, which I want to talk about in a little bit. Before we leave RFK Jr., I was looking into who his deputy secretary would be, which is a guy named Jim O'Neill. And he's apparently a longtime associate of Peter Teal, of all people. They co-founded the Mithril Capital Management, a venture fund that invests in medical technology and other startup companies. I don't know if I'm as terrified of this pick because it sounds like they'll probably just try and give themselves, no bid government contracts to do unnecessary things. But what do you know of like Teal's, tentacles on all this?
Teal is in everything. I mean, he is everywhere. And I mean, so in one sense, in terms of being a VC, he has his money spread out across, many, many companies. So you can't always pinpoint one and be like, that's evil, that's not. But as a human being, he is horrible. Everything he touches, he's a horrible presenter. He has very strange thoughts about reality. And what he did to Gawker and the Hulk Hogan, media scandal was just indicative of his own neuroses. So anyone who actually goes, and he gave us JD Vance, we shouldn't forget that. Anyone who goes into business with him, I would be highly questionable of. I don't know his role with RFK at this point, though.
He's got those twins. Who are these twins? We talked about them briefly. You get, or not the twins, the brother and sister. They're not twins.
Casey and Callie Means.
Casey and Callie Means. Callie was on, I believe, Bill Maher talking a bunch of gobbledygook about
Casey. Casey was on Bill Maher.
See, I don't even know.
Callie is the brother. Callie is the brother. Casey is, or is it Kaylee? Kaylee or Callie?
Kaylee is the brother. Cassie is the sister. They are. So Callie is a Harvard and Stanford trained business graduate who interned at the Heritage in 2004. He goes on and rails against big pharma and big healthcare and all the bad things. And then his company called TrueMed basically uses a loophole in our system to use FSA and HSA dollars to buy things like supplements and ice baths and red light therapy. So and if you go to TrueMed's site, it says this is True Healing. Nothing on the site is FDA regulated or approved. Casey was training as a head and neck specialist right here in Portland, Oregon at OHSU. She left in her 5th year of residency after training at Stanford to write books about hormone health, but she's not trained in endocrinology. And she also sells supplements. She's the co-founder of a company called Levels, which sells continuous glucose monitors, mostly for non-diabetics in the biohacking space. So these are just examples of really polished people who come from business backgrounds who are able to capture the affect of what you flagged earlier about all the problems of the healthcare system, turn around and then sell unregulated and untested products.
And yet Elizabeth Holmes is behind bars. Wow.
Well, that's the thing.
If only I had held on and turned okay, first of all, let's all agree. If Elizabeth Holmes had not been Face the Music, she would be in the Trump administration right now. Can we just? Thank you. Okay,
100.
And I think that's something essential that Derek is pulling out there, which is that for all of the purification fetish and all of the chemophobia, it's like on one hand it's like do not take this vaccine, and then there's a trench coat that opens, right, and there's a whole sort of shelf of supplements inside saying take these instead, which of course haven't been through any testing, and that somebody made in their garage or whatever.
Absolutely. Victroid on Twitch says H1N1 is just around the corner, just in time for another Trump presidency. Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to ask you guys, like, what are you advising people to do? What are you advising maybe your listeners or just the general public or parents? Like, what do you guys have thoughts about how, and I know it is hard for y'all because you, I think, so brilliantly advocate the need for collectivity and like policy reform versus individualistic response, right? That's the premise that got us into this. But I guess I'm just asking you, like, what have you been, other than rising up and, doing revolution, like, what are you guys thinking?
So my heuristic has always been watch what they say and then watch what they sell. And it's a very good sense of guidance. So if you're seeing someone charismatic on social media or in these Maha circles saying that there are problems with healthcare, problems with big pharma, yes, absolutely. But they're not getting to the right ones. So if they're saying these things are evil, buy these things instead, if there's a sales pitch at the end, that is always a red flag.
Yeah.
If something sounds, and this comes from, I just interviewed Rohin Francis recently for a separate project I have, who's a cardiologist in the UK. And I asked him a similar question, and he said, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So when Mark Hyman, who's also consulting with RFK Jr., comes out in his latest newsletter and says, can cacao fight cancer? Yeah, sounds too good to be true. So guess what? It's not true. And that's a very important thing to consider.
Yeah. Can you just go ahead. Go ahead, Matt.
No, go ahead. You go ahead, Fran.
I'm jumping all over the place, but can you just remind people about RFK Jr.'s work in American Samoa and what happened?
Yeah. Do you have the timeline, Derek? Accurate? It's I mean, I've got the details, some of the details.
I don't have all the timeline. We wrote that chapter a year and a half ago.
So
yeah.
But just give the broad level.
Yeah, the broad level sort of picture is that there was a disastrous medical accident involving 2 children dying, I believe, because of a poorly administered MMR vaccine, and I think it was because the actual the liquid or the saline solution was either contaminated or it was the wrong one. 2 children died. RFK Jr. sends a letter to the president of American Samoa and says, I think you got to take a look at taking the vaccine off the shelves. I don't think it's been tested properly. He gives him all of this bullshit. The guy believes him, takes it out of circulation, and then there's, within 2 years or something like that, there's a huge outbreak and 80 people die. And RFK Jr. has disclaimed this. He has said he's had nothing to do with it, even though we have the letter and we know that he went and he visited with,
he traveled, yes,
with the anti-vax contingent in that country. I forget the woman who was leading at the time, but she was a very sort of popular influencer, right up his alley, of course. And yeah, so blood on his hands, obviously.
Yeah,
we had Scott Kennedy on, who directed a film on this topic, and he actually got Bobby Kennedy on camera talking about it. And Scott held him to the fire, and Bobby just talked in circles. And it was recently that was revisited because Neil deGrasse Tyson was on Bill Maher, and he referenced that documentary, which Neil was involved with, which you can watch on PBS right now. So it's a very clear trail of damage that he's done, but he's denied it at every turn.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.